Thanks very much. I am Sharon Pedersen, and we brought together today 3 sponsoring organizations to sponsor our speakers, and they are Jews for Secular Democracy, Michigan Unitarian Universalist Social Justice Network, and Inclusive Justice of Michigan. And you may hear more about these organizations as we go along. And with me tonight is Jay Kaplan, the LGBTQ plus rights project staff attorney for ACLU-Michigan, and also Emme Zanotti, the Advocacy and Outreach Director of Equality Michigan. I will let them introduce themselves any more that they want to say about their background or organizations as they're speaking, but we will be getting right into the presentation. We're going to have Jay talk first, and then Emme. And if you would put your questions in the chat, that would be really appreciated. We'll have Q&A following each of their presentations, and that way I bet Emme will cover a lot of things that you thought of to ask. But both of them gave wonderful presentations to a meeting I was in last month, so I really wanted to have them back for a wider audience to hear what they had to hear or had to say. So take it away, Jay.
Thanks, Sharon. It's a pleasure to be here. And not too much in addition to Sharon's introduction. The ACLU of Michigan has had an LGBTQ plus project for now. It's going to be on 23 years, and we're lucky to be a state that has an affiliate of the ACLU specifically with a project that is specifically devoted to LGBTQ issues in our state. And I thought I would start out by kind of just giving a snapshot of the way things look in Michigan, because they certainly look different than they looked in 2001. So let's talk about let's first start talking about all the good things that are happening and that we have in our state. First, we have a governor who supports LGBTQ rights and who would veto, any anti-LGBTQ legislation, and has developed policies that are supportive of our LGBTQ community. So I just want to give you an example. We are for our Michigan Medicaid policy, where we see many other states, their Medicaid policy either has denial of coverage for transgender-related health care. Michigan's Medicaid program doesn't have any such prohibitions on covering this for Medicaid insurance companies. And in addition, Michigan requires that these Medicaid insurance companies have to look to what the experts in the transgender healthcare field have said about the medical necessity of a gender-affirming care for transgender people. So in other words, medically necessary care for the transgender community has to be covered under our Michigan Medicaid program. We also just had a new policy that came out of the state of Michigan involving when someone's on public assistance and they're receiving assistance for financial assistance for their children, if they used a sperm donor, which is the case for many LGBTQ families that have children. In the past, the policy required that if you knew who your sperm donor was, it was someone known to you, that you had to share identifying information with the state of Michigan about that donor. And sometimes caseworkers in the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services or county prosecutors, they would mischaracterize who that sperm donor was, and they would go after the sperm donor for child support. They would treat the sperm donor as an absentee father, which is ridiculous, and it could potentially upset the stability of LGBTQ families. So after a lot of advocacy, the state of Michigan has changed their policy. They no longer require that you have to share the identity of the known sperm donor, and they recognize how that policy was interfering with the stability of LGBTQ families. So that's just 2 examples of this administration's support for LGBTQ issues. We have an attorney general who, we know she's a member of the LGBTQ community, and any cases that have gone before our state court, or even in federal challenges, her office has represented LGBTQ rights. She's been on the side of LGBTQ rights. And when there's been the opportunity to submit what's called amicus briefs, they're called front of the court legal briefs, to other courts involving LGBTQ issues, Michigan has always been on the side of LGBTQ rights. We have a Secretary of State who's not only supportive of LGBTQ people, but has implemented policies in the past uh, 5 or 6 years that have made it easier for transgender and non-binary individuals in our state to get accurate identity documents. So in other words, you to get a gender marker change on your driver's license or your state ID, now you just fill out a sworn affidavit as to your gender identity. They also added a third option for people who identify as gender non-binary. The Secretary of State's office has also made it clear that, Michigan has an election law that requires if you had a legal name change less than 10 years before you run, that you have to have on the ballot your former legal name, which could out many trans people. Yet the Secretary of State's office has interpreted that provision to not require a person to have to disclose their former name. They've treated the person's new name, if it's been less than 10 years, as a common law name change. So that's taking care of that problem. We have for the first time in the last 4 years, we have a progressive majority on the Michigan Supreme Court. And that has resulted in some real positive results for the LGBTQ community. So for example, in 2022, the Michigan Supreme Court interpreted our state civil rights laws, which prohibit sex discrimination, as covering LGBTQ people. That discrimination because of homosexual status or transgender status is considered to be sex discrimination. And then, of course, we're going to talk about the legislature and amending our Elliott Larson's civil rights law to add the explicit categories of sexual orientation and gender identity. Also, just this last summer, our Michigan Supreme Court found that same-sex couples who were prohibited from being able to marry and to be recognized as equitable parents. In other words, you have one legal parent and you have the other co-parent who is raising the child. That parent, under certain circumstances, can be recognized under law as a legal parent. So the first time the court recognizing the need to give legal recognition to both parents, even if they were prohibited from getting married until 2015. So that's a significant gain. And for the first time in almost 2 decades, we are now actually looking to our state courts to interpret our laws with regards to LGBTQ rights. That was something when I first started back in 2001, our Michigan Supreme Court at that time was very ideologically driven against LGBTQ rights and was an activist court. And we tried to avoid the state courts at all costs. And now we're actually looking to the state court to help advance rights on behalf of LGBTQ people. I know Emmy's going to get more into this, but for the first time in 40 years, we have a progressive majority in our state legislature. And that resulted in us finally being able to amend our state civil rights law to explicitly include the categories of sexual orientation and gender identity. And I know Emily's going to talk about the conversion therapy ban, but for the first time, we can be proactive on legislation and legislation that benefits the LGBTQ community. Because of this progressive majority, the bills can get a committee hearing, they can be voted out of committee hearing, and they can move forward. For two decades that I've been working, any pro-LGBTQ legislation often was bottled up. It never even got a hearing, and it pretty much died after it was introduced. So we have an opportunity to pass positive public policy in our state. So these are all really, really good things. And people are now looking to Michigan as a stronghold, as a good place to be, if you're LGBTQ, to live based on our policies and based on the leadership that's in our state. Let's talk a little about the challenges. So our legislative majority is a very small one in both the House and Senate. And we know that, elections have consequences. And, in this year's election, the whole majority could change. with regards to the legislature. And I'm not I have to do a little research. I'm not exactly sure. I believe there are some justices on the Michigan Supreme Court who might be up for reelection this year. And that could also have an influence on whether or not there's still a progressive majority. And then we know in 2026, the governor's race, attorney general, and the secretary of state, and it all could change things overnight. And all those gains that we've made policy-wise could change. And that's why it's so important to participate in the elections. And it's so important to understand who's running and what their positions are and what they can do, because it can certainly make a significant difference. Our other challenges is that in the previous administration, the Trump administration, Trump was able to appoint more judges on the federal bench than any president in a 4-year term. Many of those judges that were appointed were recommended by the Heritage Foundation or the Federalist Society, very conservative. Also, some of those judges in lower courts had records of issuing opinions that were against LGBTQ rights. They are now on the bench, lifetime appointments, and they are interpreting federal challenges in courts, and we're seeing some negative and harmful decisions. With regards to the United States Supreme Court, President Trump was able in 4 years to appoint 1/3 of the justices on the United States Supreme Court. Think of that. Somebody who lost the popular vote, was impeached twice, appointed 1/3 of the justices on the U.S. Supreme Court. Clearly, some of those justices who've articulated positions against LGBTQ rights. So whereas we celebrated 4 years ago in 2020, the Bostock versus Clayton County opinion, which said that gay and transgender employees were protected under Title VII, which is a federal civil rights law that prohibits sex discrimination in employment. Now we don't see this court as going to issue any favorable opinions on LGBTQ rights. And the LGBTQ rights organizations across the country are all scrambling and doing as much as they can to avoid having any case coming up to the United States Supreme Court. And those cases involve transgender students being able to play sports, the issue of bathrooms, other things regarding religious exemptions to civil rights protections. Very, very concerned about what this current U.S. Supreme Court 6-3 conservative majority could do on this. And just recently, the Circuit Court of Appeals, Michigan's part of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals that includes Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. President Trump was able to appoint 6 judges onto that circuit, kind of changing the configuration. It used to be kind of split between progressive and conservative, and now it's clearly a conservative court. And we just saw 2 months ago that the Sixth Circuit upheld Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming care for transgender youth, saying that this was constitutional. And as a result of that, that meant that Kentucky's ban, which a lower court had overturned, that became constitutional. And as a result of that opinion, Michigan, we're surrounded by states, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Indiana, all that have bans on providing gender-affirming care for transgender youth. And many of families living in these other states are looking to Michigan, hopefully, to be able to come into Michigan and to be able to access gender-affirming care. We've also seen, just given all the progress that's been made on LGBTQ rights, we've seen an increase in anti-LGBTQ legislation in state legislatures, 500% increase in anti-LGBTQ bills being introduced in state legislatures, most of them attacking transgender kids. And I mentioned to you about sports, access to gender-affirming treatment, using in school chosen names and pronouns, accessing bathrooms, being able to get gender marker changes on birth certificates and driver's licenses. You heard about Florida, the Don't Say Gay law that prohibits schools from even talking about issues and situations involving LGBTQ people. And what we've seen is this is a political strategy by, I know we're nonpartisan, I'll just say it's by a particular political party that has decided that that this kind of stuff is necessary to gain support in their base and to raise money. And they've made this a priority in state legislatures. And so at this point in time, we have, I believe it's 22 states that have a gender affirming care ban. And, I'm just going to editorialize. There's the rationale behind these bills. It's not about facts. It's not about actual problems. It's a cold and cynical political calculation that if we attack trans people, we're going to get votes and we're going to raise money and it's going to be successful for us. And we don't have to talk about other issues that are important to people in our state. And you saw what just recently happened in Ohio. The governor, who is a Republican governor, vetoed the anti-trans gender affirming care bill and the sports bill, and yet the legislature came back early to override his veto, and now that's enshrined in law. So this is, with all the progress we're seeing made, we're seeing a great deal of backlash in a number of states. And that's why it's so important that Michigan, continues to keep its policy people and elected officials who are supportive of LGBTQ rights. I don't mean to say that everything is all, sunshine and roses in the state of Michigan. We've also seen at the very local level, particularly in school districts, efforts to pass policies that go against the rights of LGBTQ students. And I'm just going to be honest. Let's say to go against the rights of transgender students, bathroom policies that don't permit trans students to use restrooms that align with their gender identity, a great deal of efforts to try to ban books that contain LGBTQ characters or stories in school libraries as well as public libraries. You've probably heard about Moms for Liberty. I know there's a lot of new controversy about them, but there's a significant number of chapters of Moms for Liberty in the state of Michigan. They have a list of books. Most of them are, contain LGBTQ situations or characters, and they circulate that list. And their mission is to demand that school boards and school districts remove those library books. And they're very aggressive, and they engage in a lot of vitriol at these school board meetings. And sometimes school board members find themselves even being threatened if they don't go along with this. The law, based on the U.S. Supreme Court decision in the PICO case, which is more than 40 years old, is that school districts and public libraries, they can't remove books because they don't like the topics in those books. That would be illegal censorship in violation of the First Amendment. However, school districts, public library boards, they have a great deal of discretion if they think that there's explicit sexual content or language or violence in a book to be able to try to remove those books. But like I said, it's been a real challenge to to fight back against this. But what we are finding is that these folks who want to censor books, they certainly don't represent the majority of people, most even in what we would consider some of the most conservative communities. And when other people mobilize and speak up and say, this is not what we want, and we will make our own decisions about what our children read, you don't make those decisions for us, they've been successful. So we have to continue fighting back against these kinds of efforts. We've also seen in school districts as well as in local communities removing the pride flag. And the argument goes that if we allow the pride flag as a school district or as a local government, that means we have to allow all flags. That's not what the law actually says. And both school districts and local governments also have freedom of speech rights, and they can decide what their values are and how to articulate those values. They can have the pride flag, and it doesn't mean they have to have a flag, the Ku Klux Klan flag. It doesn't mean that they have to have a flag that represents something in opposition to LGBTQ rights. And usually what's happening, they'll pass this kind of neutral policy saying no flags or symbols that represent any other groups except the state flag or the school flag or the United States flag. And what it is, it's sending a message to LGBTQ young people in our state that somehow recognizing them and somehow showing support for them is wrong. And it definitely does damage. But we've seen this happen a lot with many of our local school districts. And so I think what we see here is the need not only to be engaged in statewide politics as well as national politics, but our very, very local politics. Who's running for the school board? Who's running for city council? Who's running for your library board? And how about you running for some of these things too? But to know what their positions are and to be aware and to speak out and to have a voice because a lot of people, I know myself, I'd never really paid much attention to school board elections. And, I would see whoever had the most signs or something like that. I saw the most signs that might provide name recognition, but we can't go by that. We have to be engaged at the most granular level about local, decisions that are being made policy wise, including our local school districts and our local communities, and including also the library board. Who's running for the library board? And so, in closing, I just wanted to make clear is that we have a lot to be grateful for, and people are looking to Michigan kind of as a leader for the first time. I've been here once again for 23 years, and to see Michigan, taking this position and people pointing to Michigan as a model state with regards to policies, that's a lot. That's much cause to celebrate. But we have to understand that this majority, these gains are in a fragile situation that can definitely be overturned or changed, based on elections, based on lack of participation. We saw what happened in 2016 when many people stayed home. We saw, the consequences and the collateral damage from 2016 just keeps on giving, particularly with regards to our federal courts. And we don't want that to happen again. So this is great that you're here tonight and that, that we stay informed and we stay engaged and we encourage everybody to get out and vote. Nobody should be staying home. And I don't care if people say it's a cliche that this is the most important election that we'll ever have, because you know what? It's true. Probably every election is going to be the most important election during this time. So
Hey
thank
Jay,
you. Yeah.
before we pause for some questions, I have one. Can you just really quick touch on, as it relates to the Supreme Court, one specific administrative rule change this year that was significant for the trans community?
Thank you. I did forget that. Yes. So the Michigan Supreme Court, and this was in response to, there was a lower court decision involving a transgender criminal defendant. And one of the judges who was on the Court of Appeals for Michigan, in his concurrence opinion, went on this diatribe against the idea about respecting the gender pronouns of transgender people. It was quite offensive. And a bunch of LGBT organizations wrote a letter to the Michigan Supreme Court, raising our concern and the need for more cultural competency in Michigan courts. And as a result of that, the Michigan Supreme Court considered a court rule that requires court employees to respect the pronouns of all parties before the court. In other words, if someone says, I use these pronouns, or I want to be referred by this name, by my particular chosen name, the court has to respect that. That's really significant. And Michigan is the only state in the country that has adopted a court rule requiring this. And, it's terrific. And it makes perfect common sense to me, because court employees, judges, are public servants. They're elected by the people in Michigan. Taxpayers, we pay their salary, and there's no reason why everybody should be treated with respect and feel that when they enter a courtroom, they have an equal opportunity to obtain justice as anybody else. So thank you, Emme. That was on my list, and I just passed over it.
Thank you so much, Jay. It's really an honor to hear from you, and you keep us knowing what we need to keep our pulse on. So I appreciate that you keep your pulse on how things are going. We're going to encourage people to put their questions in the chat so that they can be mostly asked after Emmy's presentation too, because I know that Emmy's got a lot to talk about now. And take it away, Emmy. Thanks. And you're muted at the moment.
Thanks, Sharon. I was replying to someone had messaged me directly, and I was trying to get my thing finished typing. So, no, I appreciate everyone joining tonight, allowing us the space to have this conversation. I have to start mandating that I speak before Jay because he's a tough act to follow. So, maybe if I ever get important enough to have contracts for these sort of things, that'll be like Article 2 or something like that. But yeah, I mean, Jay provided a lot of good information, right? So I think a lot of what I'm going to share will be complementary of that. Maybe try to make it a little interactive. So let's use the chat. Does everyone know where the chat function is down at the bottom? Little bubble next to the participants. So that's how you pull up your chat bar if you don't know. So let's start with the wins. So this was pretty significant. As Jay said, there's a Democratic majority in the Michigan legislature for the first time since 1983, right? For our purpose, or I should say a trifecta, they call it, for our purposes, as it relates to an LGBTQ organization, we don't refer to these things in such partisan terms. What matters to us is whether the legislature as a majority supports the LGBTQ community and pro-LGBTQ policy. And from that purpose, this is the first time in our state's entire history we've had a pro-LGBTQ legislature, right? When the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act was being signed into law, Attorney General Dana Nessel said, this is the first time in Michigan's history that a piece of legislation has been enacted that specific intent was to make Michigan a better and safer and more inclusive place for LGBTQ individuals. The first time in our state's entire history. So I thought that was significant. But let's start with, in the chat, let's throw it all out there really quick. Just like, name something you saw the legislature do this year that you would perceive as being pro-LGBTQ. ELCRA, yes. Does everyone know what ELCRA stands for? I will share. So ELCRA is the term we all use in our little bubble, but realize that acronyms are not transparent for people. So the E is Elliott, the L is Larson, and then the CRA is Civil Rights Act. So in 1976, Michigan passed the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act. Elliott, Larson, two different people, one Democrat, one Republican. At the time, probably looking to Jay for affirmation, probably one of the most comprehensive civil rights laws in the whole country. And Michigan civil rights law still today is one of the more comprehensive civil rights laws in the country. In 1983, a closeted gay Republican named Jim Dressel introduced a bill to add gay and lesbian people to the Civil Rights Act. It didn't pass. Jim Dressel later died of HIV. So, a sad ending to that story, obviously. Versions of this bill, I think, have been introduced in every legislature since almost, and with no success. Actually, Governor Whitmer, when she was the Senate minority leader in, I think, 2011 or 12, we saw there was potential to move a version of this bill that would have cut trans people out, and it just included gay and lesbian individuals. And after consulting with community leaders, the then Senate minority leader decided not to go through with that policy, which was, I think, significant to where we stand as a community together. But fast forward to 2023, very first day of the legislature, we see State Senator Jeremy Moss, Michigan's first openly gay state senator, introduce a bill, SB 4, I believe, which added gender identity and expression and sexual orientation to our state Civil Rights Act. The governor signed that bill into law last March. So that's the first one. I also see banning conversion therapy for kids. That was the second big legislative win we got in 2023 for the LGBTQ community in Michigan. And I want to make sure I go into specifics on this one as to make sure it's not misleading. We have pretty broad religious protections in the U.S. at a federal level as it relates to our Constitution. So there are limits to what we can do as it relates to like an outright ban on conversion therapy. So what Michigan did was passed a version of a bill we've seen in about 22 other states now in the US, which prohibits licensed practitioners from using their licensure to practice conversion therapy on minors, okay? And so it creates sanctions for practitioners who do that. This is significant. For those who don't know what conversion therapy is a really barbaric practice of trying to, via sometimes, emotional torture, physical torture, trying to teach an LGBTQ person that they're not LGBTQ, and especially a young person. So they might try to teach them that their same-sex attraction is sinful, and they might lie to the person and say, but you know what? If you keep coming to therapy with me, I can change that. I've saved other people, right? And so what happens with 16, 17-year-olds, 14-year-olds even, right? They're showing up under the assumption that something's wrong with them, that they're broken, but they can be fixed. And then after showing up to conversion therapy and doing this for multiple sessions and not being able to be fixed, they start to think it's just something that must be inherently wrong with them, right? So you can see what kind of psychological damage that could be done to a child by making them feel that way. And we see LGBTQ young people who have been subjected to conversion therapy or threatened with conversion therapy have a suicide rate that is over twice as much as other LGBT young people who haven't been subjected to conversion therapy. And so we see the conversation of suicidality elevated a lot as attacks against LGBTQ kids, without obviously acknowledging things like this, which is the conditions with which we force LGBTQ people generally, but especially young people to live in our society, and the impact that has on emotional and mental health. So the governor signed that bill into law in July. So absolutely imperative for folks to know that bill will be effective now. It will go into effect on February 13th this year. Also important to know the limitations, right? Adults can still, be subjected to conversion therapy. Churches could still practice conversion therapy within their own, private grounds or facilities, things like this. What can't happen is licensed practitioners cannot practice conversion therapy on young people. So that's just making sure we're all aware of what that is and what it isn't. I'll also speak to Motor City Pride, which is the second weekend in June every year. Right before the parade kicked off this year, Governor Whitmer signed an executive order establishing Michigan's first statewide LGBTQ commission, which functions kind of as a part of the Department of Health and Human Services. And so they'll advise government bodies and administration and even the legislature on pertinent issues, policies related to the LGBTQ community. I dropped a link in the chat a few minutes back. That link is just to who the commissioners are for this first go around. There'll be some ramping up time, right, for a brand new commission. So I know someone said they saw a statement and nothing else yet. I can't say with 100% certainty, but I would think you're looking at a couple months before you really start to see a fully functional, operable commission. So if you haven't seen anything, that's why. It just takes time for these commissioners to get together and work out calendars and set their quarterly meeting cadence and all of these things they have to kind of tackle before they get going. So that's the update there. I will say, as we moved out of the summer and into the fall and the legislature came back, there were a couple more significant pieces of legislation that started to move. The first is the Speaker Pro Tem of the Michigan State House, Representative Lori Pohutsky, an openly bisexual woman, introduced a bill to ban the use of what we call the LGBTQ panic defense mechanism. And so what the LGBTQ panic defense is when you commit violent assault or even murder of an LGBTQ person. And then in court, you use the argument that you were almost triggered when you found out about their status as a transgender individual or a gay individual. And that angst and triggering is what led you to commit an act of violence or harm against this person. it's pretty rare these days where we see someone have their sentence, or like be completely acquitted for using the defense. But what we also often see is serious crimes with pretty significant sentence reductions when this defense is used. And so it's been used a few times in Michigan's history. And Representative Pohutsky's bill would effectively ban the use of the panic defense mechanism in the courtroom. So that bill made it through the Michigan State House just before they wrapped up last year, and it's sitting there as they return to the Michigan State Legislature this year. It's now sitting in the Senate. So now it's up to the Senate to take that bill the rest of the way. And of course, we anticipate that Governor Whitmer wouldn't hesitate to sign that bill when it got to her desk. The other piece of legislation that moved out of the State House toward the end of last year has not necessarily been branded as an LGBTQ bill, but certainly benefits the LGBTQ community, is a package of bills affecting surrogacy in Michigan. So Michigan, I think, is the last state in the country technically to criminalize surrogacy. So it establishes clear contractual rights for people engaging in surrogacy relationships, right? And making sure people aren't on both sides, people who are willing to be surrogates, people seeking surrogates, who are operating in this gray zone between legal and illegal. And it creates a lot of issues for both parties in those situations and leaves people really vulnerable to harm and misconduct. And so a package of bills to address that also made it out of the Michigan State House before the end of the year, and that's also sitting in the Michigan State Senate. So those are our bills that we will look for the Senate to move in short order this year. In terms of Equality Michigan and our probably most significant priority legislatively is a package of bills that's been being worked on for almost a year now and was introduced just before the legislature split in the fall in 2023. And that is a package of bills, HB 5300 through HB 5303, which eases the legal name change process, not just for transgender individuals in Michigan, but also for survivors of human trafficking, survivors of domestic violence, survivors of stalking. Those bills have been endorsed by the commissioners of the Michigan State Bar. At least the name change bill that affects the probate court has. So that's a pretty significant win. For those who aren't familiar with the legal name change process in Michigan, I will just share a few really significant pieces. One, we require a fingerprints in the state of Michigan. So typically you would go get your fingerprints done at your county sheriff's office. 2 copies is mandated. They would send 1 copy to the Michigan State Police for a criminal background check and 1 copy to the FBI for a criminal background check. I'm sure there's a lot of gun violence prevention advocates on this call. Could you imagine if we took possession of firearms as seriously as we take trans people changing their legal names? Unbelievable. So a pretty significant barrier for a lot of people. And Michigan's actually one of only 6 states in the entire country that requires fingerprints and a criminal background check to get your legal name changed. So that's one big obstacle. Additional obstacles, we require people to publish their court dates in 2 newspapers in statute. So obviously we know that everyone continues to go to newspapers as their singular source of information in 2023. So that's a very modern law. So we gotta get that adjusted, worked on, but that's still a barrier for people today as well. The last component is, as it relates to criminal backgrounds, we indicate in statute today that having a criminal background is an automatic assumption of fraudulent intent when changing your name. So it's really a guilty until proven innocent kind of mechanism for people with criminal backgrounds trying to change their legal names. Also a significant barrier for the LGBTQ community, who, due to a number of societal environmental factors, interact with the criminal justice system and the incarceral system at a disproportionate rate, from the juvenile justice system all the way through to adulthood, right? And so just a lot of barriers that exist today in the legal name change process. And so we'll be addressing all of those with this legislation. So eliminating the criminal background check process and replacing it with a self-attestation process when you're doing your petition to change your legal name. Also creating some very explicit exemptions, so waivers for publication. That includes people who are survivors of domestic violence, human trafficking, stalking, and changing your name to affirm your gender identity, right? So those will be now good reasons for a judge to waive the publication requirement. And then we're eliminating that language that specifically says having a criminal background means you're changing your name fraudulently until you prove otherwise. For trans individuals who are disproportionately lower income, the legal name change process can cost up to $1,000 for some folks, and that's not accessible. It's not reasonable, and it's a huge barrier to a healthy life here in our state. So, HB 5300 will address that. There's also two pieces of two other components in the legislation getting a little feedback. There we go. Thank you. The other two components in this legislation are some of the executive policies actually Jay talked about. So taking Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson's policy of self-attestation for gender marker changes on IDs and driver's licenses, and then also the non-binary gender marker, the X gender option. So codifying that into law. So if we were to ever have a Secretary of State who wasn't supportive of trans individuals, they would not just be able to simply kind of get rid of that policy with the stroke of a pen and a press release, right? They would have, like, the legislature would actually have to overturn that. So we'd focus on that. And the same thing with birth certificates, a bill specifically trying to create a self-attestation process for changing the gender marker on birth certificates and adding the non-binary designation there. So those are the really significant pieces of legislation we're looking at in 2024. I think beyond that, a lot of you have probably seen other I would say, progressive legislation. And I'll just acknowledge that those things also benefit the LGBTQ community. Reproductive justice and reproductive rights directly benefit the LGBTQ community. Other enhancements we've made to the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act. I don't know who's familiar with the Crown Act that Senator Sarah Anthony passed that prevents discrimination based on hair textures and styles. Goes a long way in protecting Black women from discrimination in the workforce. Certainly we celebrate that and see that as a direct win for the LGBTQ community. Gun violence prevention legislation we see as a direct win for the LGBTQ community. Voting rights, accomplishments we see as a direct win. For those who aren't aware, now that we're heading into an election year, we actually have an election in 8 days. In 2 House districts, we have special elections, and then we have the presidential primary, next month at the end of February. We'll start to see significant voting rights this year get enshrined in law, right? So we have the 9-day early voting window now. We have the mandatory ballot drop boxes. Being a permanent absentee voter now, being registered for that, doesn't just mean you get sent the application every year. It means you actually get sent the ballot now. There's not the 2-step process once you're registered, just the 1-step process now. So that's significant. And then creating the online ballot tracking system to help people trust what's happening with their ballot once it's turned in, knowing if there's issues with it. Just the whole process is getting more accessible. And I think we see that as a direct win for the LGBTQ community as well. So I think, while we're just talking about some of the LGBTQ specific things, we recognize that a lot of the legislation that our progressive partners in the advocacy space have advocated for certainly make Michigan a better place for LGBTQ community members. And this is something I talk about when we say, how do we make Michigan a better place for people coming from Ohio, where they're passing anti-trans laws, or Indiana, where they've passed anti-trans laws. And the reality is, I think we have to keep doing what we're doing, right? We have to recognize that Michigan's starting point at the beginning of last year is not where maybe the state of Washington was or the state of California was, right? And we have, a lot of catching up to do, and we just have to keep putting in that work and keep making our state more inclusive for all underrepresented, marginalized communities, and that includes the LGBTQ community, specifically includes the trans community. And so that's what we've been up to. I know we have about 15 minutes-ish left, so I want to stop right there and make sure there's time for questions. I saw some stuff rolling through the chat.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to add really quickly, the surrogacy bills, not only do they deal with the issue of, procreating families through surrogacy agreements, but they equalize in terms for same-sex couples. In other words, there's certain presumptions of parenthood. If a child is born during a marriage, there's a presumption that in a heterosexual marriage, that the father is the legal parent of the child. We don't have some of those same presumptions for same-sex married couples. And we sometimes see even legally married same-sex couples, they have to go through a step-parent adoption for the other parent who's the non-biological parent to be recognized. So this would also recognize marriage equality and make things more equally regarding parental recognition.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Anything
Sharon.
else, Emmy? Oh, I just wanted to say that you addressed one of my questions I was thinking about what's going to happen as these other surrounding states become more conservative about trans rights. So you addressed, we just keep doing what we're doing. So what was something that caught your eye specifically in the chat, perhaps?
Oh, just wanted to address a couple of the specific legislation questions. So I see something about a bill introduced to remove the criminalization of sodomy in Michigan. Again, that is, it does say symbolic. That's true. There does need to be a repeal of that legislation. I will point out same-sex relationships and is protected, right? So I think this legislation, it needs to happen for the state of Michigan. I think there's other pieces of legislation we've been focused on that, having not passed, could have like current time implications on LGBTQ community members living in Michigan. That doesn't diminish the importance of accomplishing that specific piece of legislation. As it relates to the question about plans to educate therapists, certainly, I think one big component of that is recognizing that the Social Workers Union, the NASW, were huge proponents and supporters of this legislation. And we actually talked on their statewide day of education earlier this year about a couple of our big legislative wins, including conversion therapy. So using those partners as an outlet for this stuff is always significant because they're the trusted messenger with social workers more so than we are. And so, knowing that they're supporters of this legislation and they're going to have those conversations with their members is I think a significant way of continuing to get the word out. We also ran selective social media in certain communities, making sure people are aware that the legislation's, happened and been accomplished so that families are aware. I think, one of the things State Senator Mallory McMorrow had actually introduced bills, identical versions of these bills in the Senate. It was the House bills that got the governor's signature in the Public Act. But one of the things State Senator McMorrow had addressed in conversations with me, and I think even in her testimony on these bills, were that she had parents in her district who reached out and were sending their openly gay teenager just to a therapist they had found online, which they thought was just to deal with the stress of having bullying issues at school and all these things, and noticed a significant depletion in their teenagers' well-being and mental health during the course of the therapy treatment. And it was then that the parents found out that the therapist they were sending their kid to, unknowing to the parents and the child, was secretly practicing conversion therapy tactics on the kid. So, educating parents on this issue is also significant because I think we get stuck in our echo chamber sometimes, and we think that you have to be a really like homophobic or transphobic person to send your kid to a conversion therapy counselor or something like that. And certainly that can be the case, but also there's a lot of cases where parents just don't understand, or these people will advertise this form of therapy as like not like as something besides pseudoscience, right? They'll advertise it as scientific, and it's not. And so even well-intended parents who just don't understand, who aren't educated, think this is like a viable option for their child. And so there's a lot of public education that needs to happen around this, and we've done some of that work so far. And
I have
Oh yeah.
Go ahead. I was going to ask a different question from the chat, but go ahead if you're not done.
Oh, I was just going to address the joint marriage resolution. Yes, that's introduced pretty significant obstacles to that right now, right? So for a statutory repeal of the constitutional Michigan state constitutional ban on marriage, what would have to happen is a 2/3 majority in both chambers would have to support that legislation, at which point it would then trigger a ballot initiative, right? And then the voters would also have to vote to repeal the statutory ban on gay marriage. And of course, that also having federal protections right now, you know, back from Obergefell in 2014, I believe, right? So that stands, I mean, the 2/3 majority certainly stands as, I think, an obstacle. For context on some of the other LGBTQ bills, ELCRA, I think between the Senate and the House combined, we managed to get the support of 11 total Republicans out of the, I want to say, let's see, 1872 between the two chambers. 11 of them supported the Civil Rights Bill with conversion therapy, which had been bipartisan in every single legislative chamber in the country, in the states that it's passed. The Michigan State House, there wasn't a single Republican who supported that legislation. So I think what we're seeing is LGBTQ bills, because they're using it as a centerpiece to fire up their base, right? That maybe 25% of the 20 to 25% of the total American populace that votes in elections, you know, using that as a motivating political issue, I think provides good reason for them to not support this legislation when it's actually moving through their chamber. And that's a reality we're up against. So I think anything you're looking at a 2/3 majority vote becomes incredibly complicated when you have pro-equality majorities of, say, 56-54 in one chamber and 2018 in another.
There's a question here for Jay also. Jay, can you speak more about when you were talking about the flag laws? So is it also true for city governments that they could choose to fly a pride flag but refuse to fly any other flag, or is that only for school districts? And can you explain why that would not contradict the First Amendment to say you're allowed to fly a pride flag, but not, you know, like a Confederate flag or some other flag?
Sure. So this would apply to both local governments as well as school districts. And some of you might be aware there was a case involving Boston, and they had in the center of the city, they'd have the flag with the American flag and the state flag and the city flag, and then they'd have a fourth pole where groups could apply to have their organization's flag flown. So in other words, what that city did was they created an open forum. They invited other people to display their symbol as presenting. And in that particular situation in Boston, they refused to allow a particular religious affiliated organization fly their flag. And that organization sued, saying that it violated First Amendment rights. And the Supreme Court agreed with them, but it was based on the circumstances. It was based on the facts, the fact that there was an open forum. So in these situations, it's not that a school district is saying, hey, we're going to allow any groups that want their flags to be flown in our school to do so. It's a situation where off with the pride flag, the school is saying, you know what, this is one of our values. We want to provide a safe and supportive school environment. Or a city could say, we want to let members of the LGBTQ community to know that they're welcome and that they're supported here. And so we're going to allow this flag. So the issue is this program, or is the way they're handling it, have they created an open forum? And if they haven't done so, if it's not something where they've opened it up to all groups to do so, then they're not subject to having to allow every other flag to be displayed there. Does that make sense? So it's particular facts.
That is
And what
interesting.
we've
Thank you
seen,
for clarifying that, because
Sure.
I actually also always believed that if you allowed a pride flag, then you had to allow, you know, any other flag that you might or might not agree with.
Right. Only if you had some kind of program that invited different groups and organizations to be able to have their flag. And you've made it clear, or people know from knowledge and from your actions taken, that this is the opportunity because school districts and local government, they're entitled to take positions on particular issues. They don't have to be, solely open on any type of governmental issue. You see, they pass resolutions, they pass, different policies and things like that. So the same thing would apply.
And I have another question for you, Jay. When you were talking about the law, that if you're running for election, that you have to also advertise any name that you have gone by in the past 10 years. And so when you were describing that this is a new policy that will allow people like transgendered people who have changed their name to not have to use their former name. So it's a two-part question. One is this a legal opinion from our Attorney General, or is this actually a change in the law? That's the first part. And the second part is, does that mean that that's the case for everybody? For example, like if I get married and change my last name, or I just change my name for any reason, would it apply to everybody that they no longer have to disclose their former name?
So yeah, thank you. Thank you for those questions and for me wanting that clarification. So it's actually a regulation from the Secretary of State's office involving elections, and it's an interpretation of that regulation. And it's not something specifically just done for transgender people. What it's saying is that if you can demonstrate that even before you got the legal name change, that you were known by this particular name, that was like a form of what's considered to be a common law change, that would fit in with that definition of changing your name within the 10-year period of time, and therefore you wouldn't have to disclose your former name. So it would have to be based on certain circumstances. So if I was not able to get a legal name, let's say I just got a legal name changed a year ago and I want to run for public office, I would have to demonstrate, or at least provide information that would indicate that for a period of up to 9 years before my legal name change, I was going by this particular name, and it should be considered to be a common law name change, and therefore I wouldn't have to identify my former name.
We actually just saw similar law exists in Ohio, and we just saw situations where two trans women who were trying to run for, I think, state rep seats in Ohio were initially tossed off the ballot because of this legal, loophole. I don't know what you call it. It's statute, but it's archaic. And one of them, I think, won her challenge, and so she'll be reinstated on the ballot with her current legal name. And then I'm not sure what happened to the second candidate yet, but yeah, I think the thing with these laws and the flexibility route, and sometimes it being up to the county clerk and things like this, it just creates a kind of a two-tiered system depending on where you live in the state. And so
Sure.
yeah.
And then policy wise, if we have a different Secretary of State, all those good policies regarding IDs and gender marker, they could all be changed, because unless we get them in statute, and that's, I know, one of the legislative, and some of the legislative initiatives. But a different Secretary of State could say, no, this regulation, this is how we interpret it. You're going to have to disclose your former name. And once again, that's why participation in this year's election and all subsequent ones is so important.
Yeah, there's a comment I got. I think someone meant to put it in the broader chat, but it got sent to me directly. Was just a question about, and I know you touched about this a little on your intro, Jay, just a wave of bans on gender affirming care and things like this. The question specifically asks, currently with a progressive majority, Michigan is a safe state, but what can we and our sister states do to protect trans communities in this election cycle? And should an anti-LGBTQ candidate be elected? So I think you're seeing an entire country of pro-LGBTQ advocates toy with these solutions in real time. Some of that happening in terms of legislation, some of it executive policy, and some of it just community actions, right? I don't know if there's one kind of silver bullet to this answer, right? But I think some of the things we can do, I think, is kind of KC called it out in her comment here, is the laws we've passed in just the last year have made people feel like Michigan's a place they can permanently come to if they're trying to leave a state where they're seeing the LGBTQ community be persecuted, right? And so I think that's one thing, is we just gotta keep voting, right? We got to hold our legislators accountable, regardless of which side of the aisle they're on, right? And we have to keep advancing this LGBTQ inclusive legislation, and the broader inclusive legislation is one reality. And I'll address specifically, a lot of conversations around like shield laws and sanctuary state laws and things like that. I think there's still a lot of components of that from Michigan's perspective that probably need to be sorted out. There's probably work with that sort of policy. We might need to say like grow, like we might have to have a slightly larger majority than we have in terms of a pro-equality majority to move this sort of legislation. I think there's some obstacles to that today. And but I don't think like anything in the next 2 to 3 years is off the table, as long as our community is able to continue to stay engaged and keep showing up, especially to the polls, right? I think that's ultimately what's going to create the most sustainable, viable solutions for our communities. And for now, I would say 2024 is a huge election year. I think a lot of folks on this call know that. I mean, definitely those are conversations we need to be having with our friends and family, though, as well. Additionally, I would say if there's one thing we can in Michigan sleep peacefully about in a very stressful election year, is that there's not a gubernatorial election this year. And that means that, we'll have Governor Whitmer, if something were to happen to the pro-LGBTQ equality legislature, Governor Whitmer is going to be a backstop until 2026. And the same with a pro-LGBTQ openly lesbian attorney general and a pro-LGBTQ secretary of state. So, we just got to keep doing the work. We got to keep engaging our community and making sure they're not just having a say in who represents them in Lansing, but then they know that the Capitol building belongs to them as much as it belongs to their state senator, their state representative, right? It's our building, and making sure the community is present there and having their voice heard.
Right. And I just want to add very, very quickly with regards to being a sanctuary state, there's nothing, we don't need necessarily a shield law at this point in time to identify programs that might exist in Michigan that might be able to assist families from out of state, but we just have to figure out what's needed to put all that together. So, and we are working on that now.
Yeah. And the comment about the DMV situation is one of the reasons that the IDDoc name change legislation is such a priority, because we've seen this been one of the first targets of conservative legislators, is to try to undo people's gender marker changes and legal name changes. And I think as many barriers we can create to them being able to do that in Michigan is ultimately going to prove to be a more protective measure for trans community members in the long run. And the last thing I'll add to the IDDoc legislation is we know through survey research that before Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson was elected and enacted or issued her policy on self-attestation, used to technically, in a convoluted way, require a surgical requirement and a doctor's note and all these things. And Michigan, by estimates, had the largest percentage of trans people in the country who had inaccurate gender markers on their IDs, almost 80%. And so there's another thing that is a third of trans people in a survey in about 2015 or 2016 who showed an ID with a gender marker that wasn't the way they identified and expressed themselves, were subject to discrimination, harassment, or even like physical violent assault because of it, right? So, getting this policy done, I think, isn't just an extension of protecting people's civil rights. It could, literally be life-saving legislation for some trans folks.
Right. And the difference is, once again, who we elected. We had one of the worst policies in the country. The ACLU sued the state of Michigan in 2015 over their policy, which was found at least, to raise some serious constitutional issues, but that was the previous administration. And that's why it's so important to be in. So sorry, Sharon, I know we've gone over time.
Yeah, so we need to wrap up, unfortunately, but I did grab the emails of people who asked to be kept up to date on things like pending legislation. There were a few other things people mentioned, but we're rest assured, between Equality Michigan and Jay's program and even Moosjin's newsletter and things like that we do with LGBT issues, we try to keep abreast of what's going on and let people know when they need to do some advocacy work and such. So in wrapping up, I did want to say that we have another seminar coming up in February. The tentative date is the 19th. And Paul pointed out that was President's Day. So if that should change, it'll come out in some emails to you and such, that Reverend Roland Stringfellow is going to talk about the tentative title is Sacred and Perhaps Secular Activism Preparing for 2024. So it's really kind of, if you want to do advocacy with faith institutions, in faith institutions, etc., or on your own around the issues you're passionate about, you can keep coming to our workshops that we're having. And it's Inclusive Justice, Moosjin, and Jews for Secular Democracy. Basically, we had some education funds from the Hope Fund of Community Foundation of Southeastern Michigan, and we decided to take them online to help people who are involved or at least on the fringes and, in touch with religious and other activism communities to work for justice with this community. So thank you very much for your time, all. Appreciate it. Thank you so much, Jay and Emme.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.